week, Senator, I was very concerned in instances in which it appears, or in instances in which regulations by the government curtail our fundamental freedoms, and in this case, freedom of speech. I share that concern. What I'm attempting to avoid is offering a judgment on a agreement with a point of view on a very hotly contested and difficult case that could certainly come before the court again.
Well, Judge, I'm really beyond the case, but I will not press it further. Let me move on with my question to you about the revisionist court, and if you join, whether you'll be on the Scalia branch or the O'Connor branch, and go back to Johnson versus Santa Clara. And Judge O'Connor takes Justice O'Connor takes Justice Scalia to task for his dissent, which he says is an academic discussion. And then I think in a very important doctrinal view is that Justice Scalia's dissent rejects the court's precedents and addresses the question of how Title VII should be interpreted as if the court were writing on a clean slate, close quote. You have already stated that you believe that constitutional interpretation is a moving body depending on the tradition and customs of our society without being rigidly controlled by original intent. And here you have Justice Scalia taking Title VII, as Justice O'Connor says, writing on a clean slate, and Justice O'Connor rejects that and says that we have to take into account the court's precedents. My question to you, would you choose a preference between the approaches between Justice O'Connor and Justice Scalia on that issue?
Senator, I think it is important for any judge to take into account, even when he or she disagrees with a particular case, to recognize that there is the additional burden and additional question of whether or not this case should be overruled. That is a question about the doctrine of stare decisis. I do not think that judges should assume simply because judges should assume simply because they disagree with a particular case that we're operating as though there was no prior case law or there no precedent, and feel free to act as though they're not in any way controlled or restrained or constrained by prior case law. My sentiments, without expressing a particular judgment on that case, my sentiments would be toward a preference for recognizing that there is significant weight to be given to existing case law, and that the burden is on the judge who wants to change that precedent to not only show why it's wrong, but why stare decisis should not apply.
Thank you. I'm going to score that one for Justice O'Connor, which may make it 1-1. Let me move on to the war powers issue, Judge Thomas, a question which has not yet been broached and one that I think is enormously important, one which you and I have discussed in the informal session which we had before the hearing started. We have just seen an historic event in the course of the past year with the Gulf War and the vote by the Congress authorizing the President to use force in the Gulf War. In your writings, you have been concerned about congressional activity in many areas. And in your speech at Brandeis University on April 8, 1988, you said, quote, "In many areas of public policy, including foreign policy making, members of Congress can thwart or substitute their will for that of the executive." And you focus on foreign policy. You have been very critical of the Congress, as I had commented earlier, noting that there is little deliberation and even less wisdom in the manner in which the legislative branch conducts its business. And in your speech on September 3rd, 1987 at the American Political Science Association, you quoted with approval a statement by Gary Jacobson that in Congress there is great individual responsiveness, equally great collective irresponsibility. There are many issues where there is a confrontation between the President and the Congress, which we all know. And I would like your views as to the authority of the Congress under its constitutional exclusive responsibility to declare war, as opposed to the President's authority as Commander-in-Chief, which is a very central issue. Was a central issue earlier this year. Let me start with the question that I told you I was going to ask you, and that is whether the Korean conflict was in fact a war.
Senator, in response to our informal discussions, did attempt to resolve an issue that scholars and political scientists, lawyers seem to have been debating for the last 40 years. And I recognize, I believe, as I indicated to you, that the hostilities in Korea and the President's response, of course, I don't think that there was a suggestion that the President could not respond. But your question at the time went to whether or not there should have been a declaration of war.
Correct.
And the short answer to that is, from my standpoint, is I don't know. I've attempted to look at that question, but again, it's one that scholars haven't resolved and that legal minds haven't been able to resolve. And I think that I would be imprudent to attempt to resolve it in this environment.
Well, Judge Thomas, when I asked you the question in our informal session as whether the Korean conflict was a war, you said you'd asked that question of Judge Souter, and I said that's right. And he ducked, and then I said, well, let me give you the weekend. He came back and he said, I don't know. Now, I thought that was okay under those circumstances where it was from Friday to Monday, but you and I talked about this on August 1st, and now it's September 16th. And I don't think that the Korean incident is going to be repeated. It's not asking you to comment on a pending case, and it's well established historically as to what happened. And this is a crucial issue as to whether American troops are going to be committed to combat on the President's word alone as Commander-in-Chief, or whether it's going to require a congressional declaration of war. So to the extent that I can push it just a little bit, let me repeat the question. Was it a war?
Senator, this isn't one of the instances in which I'm saying that the issue of whether or not the the hostilities in Korea was a war would be coming before the court. This is an instance when, as I've indicated to you, I simply don't know.
Well, let me try again. Instead of moving to an easier question, I'll move to a harder one. In early January of this year, there was a lot of debate as to whether the President had the authority to commit troops in the Gulf War without a resolution. President Bush asserted he did. And this Judiciary Committee held hearings in early January, and some even suggested, I think ridiculously, that the President would be impeached if he moved ahead without waiting for a congressional resolution. I thought it was ridiculous because Congress had sat on its hands for months, and it allowed the United Nations to set a date for the use of force, January 15th, and finally Congress started some discussions on January 10th and moved on it on January the 12th. I'm not going to ask you whether you think the Constitution required congressional action or the President had the sole authority to act as Commander-in-Chief, because if you won't answer the Korea question, you're not going to answer that one. So let me ask you instead, what would the considerations be that you would work through in approaching that kind of a legal issue?
I think it's a very difficult issue, Senator.